Hi, and welcome back to this video series on the Common Rule, Habits of Purpose for an Age of Distraction. The Common Rule is a book about 8 daily and weekly habits designed to form us in the love of God and neighbor. And this video series is a guide to reading the book, discussing the concepts in a community, and most importantly, practicing the habits together. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the third weekly habit, which is the habit of fasting. What we're going to find is that restraint uniquely opens us up to feast on the real food of life, and that is God Himself. The danger we're going to see is that we live in an age of plenty, and it's uniquely possible to convince ourselves that maybe after all we can live by bread alone. Here's the reality. We live in a land full of sugar, sex, food, booze, and whatever else you want to try to numb the pain of life. Which is to say that if you live in the culture that I do, you are culturally predisposed to try to eat, drink, or sleep away your pain. And the danger of this kind of living, which is totally normal, is that it numbs us. It numbs us to everything, to who we are, to who God is, to the fact that there is terrible and constant suffering in the world, and to the fact that there is nonetheless persistent and stunning beauty in the world. So to cultivate the practice of fasting as a habit is actually to have our eyes and our hearts opened up to all of this, the good and the bad. And it's important to dwell on the suffering part for a moment, because in a real way, to fast is to suffer. And fasting is thus a way of resensitizing our hearts to the serious reality that we live in a world that suffers. Part of the beauty of fasting, the terrible beauty of it, is we remember that. We remember that there are children in our cities who don't eat. There are millions of refugees in our world that are stuck in inexpressible hells. We remember that there are coworkers in the offices next to us fighting life and death battles with depression. So to cultivate a life of rhythmic fasting is to reject the terrible fairy tale that everything is fine and to actually enter into suffering with Christ. And remember how much we long and how much our neighbors long for Christ to redeem all things. The fact is, when we live in this lie that everything's fine, we're tempted to believe the lie that we don't need a Savior. And that is why this practice of fasting is so important. It reminds us of our actual deepest need, our truest need. Here's how this looks in my life. When I'm in my best rhythms, I make Thursday a fast day. And sometimes it's from food, sometimes it's from coffee, sometimes it's from wine. But inevitably, first thing in the day when I wake up and I remember, I'm fasting today, I immediately begin to experience this low-grade anger. And as the day progresses, I get to the point where I might have a meal or a cup of coffee or whatever, and I have to skip it. And I get annoyed. And then the hunger or the headache sets in and my body begins to get angry. And I just get plain depressed. And this is why. Because I actually am a sad, angry, frustrated, impatient person who medicates with food and drink. And that is the first point of the practice of fasting. You see who you really are. But then what happens is you come out of fasting the next day, maybe you have that cup of coffee or that food, and you know what? It's actually not all that satisfying. It's not as what you remember. It doesn't fill the shape of the hole that you were trying to fill. And in this rhythm of doing this on and off and regularly, you begin to realize the most fundamental truth about yourself and the world. It's that nothing but the love of God can fill the pain of our emptiness. Which is why I say that to live without fasting is to live without knowing who you truly are. Fasting reveals the inner need that only God can fill. And that's the point, to expose the reality of our inner need and see that only Jesus can fill that. So that's the idea behind the weekly habit of fasting. As always, here's your fact to ponder, your question to discuss, and your habit to practice. Fact to ponder. There's a surge of modern research about the health benefits of fasting, but way more important than that is this. In Jesus' main teaching on fasting, he begins with the sentence, "when you fast." Really important to note that Jesus assumed something about his followers in fasting. Question to discuss. If you were going to fast from something this week, what would it be and why? And finally, does it scare you? Here's your habit to practice this week. I want you to try a 24-hour fast from something. If you're not ready for food, or if your health is not in the right place for that, don't worry. Try sugar, try social media, try anything. But pick something that you're gonna miss and then lean into that lack and see how you meet Christ there. Over the next week, you're gonna be reading about the last weekly habit, and when you come back, we're gonna talk about that. It's the weekly habit of Sabbath. Finally, remember, as with all of these, your habits will not change God's love for you, but God's love for you can and should change your habits.